The morning I finally left came 3 weeks after that conversation with Clara. We had spent those weeks moving carefully around each other, making practical arrangements with the restrained politeness of two people who had loved each other as well as they knew how, but could no longer pretend it was enough. I packed a single bag, taking only what felt essential. A few changes of clothes, some photographs of Emma and Michael from when they were small, the book I had been trying to read for months. Everything else belonged to the life I was leaving behind, artifacts of a man I had been, but could no longer continue being. Clara was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, making coffee with the same quiet efficiency she had brought to 23 years of mornings. The smell of it, rich and familiar, mixed with the lingering scent of the vanilla candle she liked to burn in the evenings. These were the perfumes of the life I was abandoning, and I stood in the doorway for a moment, trying to memorize them. She didn't turn around when I set my bag by the door, but her shoulders tensed slightly, acknowledging what we both knew was happening. On the kitchen counter, I placed my wedding ring beside her coffee cup, the gold band catching the morning light one last time. It felt strange to see my hand without it, naked and somehow lighter, like I had been carrying more weight than I realized. The children had already left for school. Emma to finish her senior year, Michael to basketball practice, and the ordinary concerns of a 15-year-old who didn't yet know his family was quietly breaking apart. We had agreed to tell them together, later, when I had found a place to stay, and we could both speak calmly about what came next. For now, their absence made leaving possible without explanations I wasn't ready to give. I drove through town slowly, taking the long way to Owen's shop, passing all the familiar landmarks of the life I had lived here. The elementary school where Clara worked, where both children had learned to read. The park where we had pushed swings and attended Little League games. The grocery store where we had shopped every Saturday for more than 2 decades. All of it looked the same, but I felt like a stranger driving through someone else's memories. The auto shop was dark when I arrived, though Owen's truck was parked in its usual spot. I sat in my car for several minutes, understanding that walking through that door would make everything irreversible in a way that packing my bag and leaving my ring had not quite accomplished. When I finally knocked, Owen answered immediately, as if he had been waiting. He took in my single bag, my bare ring finger, my uncertain expression, and stepped aside to let me in without questions. The shop smelled the same as always, motor oil and metal, and something indefinably warm. But tonight it felt like sanctuary rather than simply a place I visited. Owen was working on an engine rebuild, parts spread across his workbench with the careful organization of someone who understood how everything fit together. I sat in the folding chair I had come to think of as mine, watching him work, neither of us speaking about what my presence here meant or what came next. When he finished with the immediate task, Owen wiped his hands clean and looked at me directly. "You okay?" he asked, and I almost laughed at how inadequate that question was for everything I was feeling. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But I'm here." He nodded, understanding that sometimes being present was enough, that not every moment required certainty or plans or promises about the future. He moved to close up the shop, turning off lights and securing tools, preparing to leave this familiar space where we had discovered each other. When he suggested we drive somewhere quiet to talk, I found myself moving toward my car and then stopping, keys in my hand, suddenly uncertain about everything. Owen seemed to understand my hesitation. He opened the passenger door and gestured for me to get in, taking the keys from my hand with gentle authority. We drove out of town on roads I had traveled thousands of times but had never really seen. Past the outskirts where houses became farmland, past the places where families like mine lived their careful lives behind windows lit against the darkness. Owen drove steadily, without destination, and I understood that the movement itself was what mattered, the sense of leaving something behind and moving towards something else, even if we couldn't yet see what that something else might be. After a while, he pulled over at a rest stop overlooking the valley. The town spread below us like a constellation of ordinary lives, each light representing someone's kitchen, someone's living room, someone's bedroom where they lay beside the person they had promised to love forever. From this distance, It all looked peaceful, manageable, like problems that could be solved with good intentions and patience. We sat in comfortable silence, the engine ticking as it cooled, both of us looking out at the lights below. I thought about Clara, probably sitting in our living room now, dealing with her own version of this ending. I thought about Emma and Michael, who would wake tomorrow to discover their family had quietly rearranged itself while they slept. I thought about the photographs still hanging on our mantle, documenting years of attempting to be people we had never quite managed to become. But mostly I thought about my hands, resting in my lap, free of the ring that had defined them for so long. The absence felt strange, but not wrong, like recovering from an injury you had grown so accustomed to that you had forgotten what it felt like to move without pain. When Owen reached across the space between us and took my hand in his, the contact felt different than it had that night on the Mustang's hood. Less desperate, less secret, more like a beginning than a confession. His fingers, calloused from years of honest work, intertwined with mine, and I felt something settle into place that I hadn't known was missing. We had no promises to make each other, no certainty about where this road would lead. I was 47 years old, starting over with nothing but a single bag and the courage to finally live honestly. It was terrifying and heartbreaking and more real than anything I had done in decades. But as we sat there overlooking the town where I had spent so many years being someone else, with Owen's hand steady and warm in mine, I understood that I had finally stopped running from the truth of who I was. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, but for the first time in my life, I was traveling it as myself. When morning came, I woke to find Nathaniel gone from my bed, the indent in the mattress beside me the only evidence that the night had been real. The house had returned to its familiar rhythm. Evelyn moving quietly in the bathroom, the sound of coffee brewing downstairs, our daughters' muffled voices carrying from their rooms as they prepared for school. I lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the memory of his warmth against my side with the ordinary light of day. This is the life I built for myself at 36. A colonial house on Maple Street with cream-colored siding and black shutters. The kind of home that appears in real estate brochures under the heading, Perfect Family Neighborhood. Inside, the walls are lined with framed photographs. Wedding pictures where Evelyn and I smile with practiced ease. Birthday parties where our daughters blow out candles. Christmas mornings heavy with wrapping paper and forced joy. Each image a small monument to the story we tell ourselves about who we are. Evelyn moves through our morning routine with the efficiency of someone who has perfected the art of not asking questions. She pours my coffee into the blue mug I've used for 8 years, adds cream without being asked, sets it beside my place at the kitchen table where the newspaper waits folded to the business section. Our daughters, Emma and Claire, eat their cereal with the focused intensity that children bring to the simplest tasks, their school bags already packed and waiting by the door. This is choreography, I realized long ago. We are all dancers who have learned our steps, so well we no longer hear the music. Evelyn asks if I remembered to call the plumber about the upstairs sink. I tell her I'll do it from the office. Emma announces that she needs poster board for a science project. Claire spills orange juice on her school uniform and begins to cry. These are the small crises that fill our days, the manageable problems that keep us from examining the larger questions that hover just beyond our peripheral vision. I work at Hartwell and Associates, a small publishing house downtown that specializes in academic texts and regional histories. My office is on the 3rd floor, with a window that overlooks the parking lot and, beyond that, a strip of sky that changes color throughout the day. I edit manuscripts about soil conservation and local architecture, checking footnotes and correcting grammar with the kind of attention to detail that my colleagues find admirable and I find numbing. The work suits me because it requires nothing of my heart. I can lose myself in the mechanical precision of turning someone else's thoughts into clean, publishable prose. I eat lunch at my desk, attend meetings where we discuss print runs and marketing budgets, respond to emails with the kind of professional courtesy that reveals nothing about the person behind the signature. By 5:30, I am back in my car, driving home through neighborhoods where other men like me return to houses where other families wait with dinner and homework and stories about their day. But Nathaniel has always been the variable that disrupts this careful equation. He appeared in our lives gradually, the way old friends do when geography and circumstance finally align. First it was a phone call, then coffee when he was passing through town, then dinner invitations that Evelyn extended because she understood that friendship was important, even if she couldn't quite grasp the particular weight of this one. He is 41 now, unmarried, carrying himself with the kind of restless energy that makes settled people uncomfortable. He has been a bartender, a freelance photographer, a house sitter for wealthy families who travel extensively. He tells stories about sleeping in hostels in Prague and working on a fishing boat in Alaska, adventures that make our suburban dinner conversations feel suddenly small and airless. When he laughs, something in my chest responds in a way that I have spent years pretending not to notice. Evelyn tolerates him the way one tolerates an eccentric relative, with patience and occasional fondness, but also with the subtle distance of someone who suspects there are conversations happening just beyond her understanding. She sets an extra place at the table when he visits, asks polite questions about his work, offers him the guest room when his stays extend longer than expected. But I have seen the way she watches us sometimes, as if trying to decode a language she doesn't speak. The children adore him, which makes everything both easier and more complicated. He brings them gifts from his travels, a wooden flute from New Mexico, postcards from cities they've never heard of, stories about places where the sky looks different and people speak in languages that sound like music. He remembers their birthdays and listens to their problems with the kind of attention that adults rarely give to children. When he's here, our house fills with a different kind of energy, as if someone has opened windows in rooms that have been closed too long. In these moments, watching him help Claire with her homework or listen to Emma practice violin, I feel the dangerous pull of an alternate life. I imagine what it would be like to wake up beside him every morning, to build a life that doesn't require this constant performance of contentment. The thought terrifies me not because it feels wrong, but because it feels so achingly right. The evenings when he stays with us are exercises in careful choreography. We sit in the living room after dinner, Evelyn reading her book, the girls playing board games on the carpet, Nathaniel and I pretending to watch television while stealing glances at each other across the room. I have memorized the way he sits, one leg folded under him, his hand resting on the arm of the chair, the slight smile that appears when he catches me looking. These are the moments when the silence becomes suffocating, when the space between what is spoken and what is felt grows so wide that I can barely breathe. When I realize that the life I have built, careful and respectable as it is, feels like a prison constructed from my own fear. When I understand that the man sitting across from me represents everything I have spent my adult life running from, and everything I have ever wanted. The call came during dinner on a Tuesday in October. Evelyn answered while I helped Claire cut her chicken, her voice taking on that careful politeness she used with people she didn't quite understand. Yes, of course. No, it's no trouble at all. We'll see you soon. When she hung up, she looked at me with the expression of someone delivering news she knew would complicate her evening. Nathaniel is coming over, she said, already moving toward the linen closet. He sounded upset about something. I told him he could stay in the guest room tonight. I felt something shift in my chest, a flutter of anticipation mixed with dread that I couldn't quite name. The girls cheered. Uncle Nathaniel always brought stories and attention that broke the monotony of school nights. But as I watched Evelyn gather fresh sheets with mechanical efficiency, I wondered if she could hear the change in my breathing, see the way my hands had suddenly become unsteady. He arrived an hour later, and I knew immediately that something had broken in him. His hair was damp from the rain that had started falling as darkness settled over our neighborhood. His clothes hung on his frame differently. As if he had been carrying weight, he had finally decided to set down. When I opened the door, he looked at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and exhausted, holding a duffel bag that seemed to contain everything he owned. I broke up with Sarah, he said without preamble, stepping into our hallway and bringing with him the smell of rain and something else I couldn't identify. Vulnerability, maybe, or the particular scent of a life coming apart. She said I was never really there with her. Said I was always thinking about someone else. The words hung between us while Evelyn appeared with towels and offers of coffee, while the girls abandoned their homework to cluster around him with questions about his travels. I watched him navigate our domestic chaos with practiced ease, but I could see the tremor in his hands, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Whatever had happened with Sarah had stripped away some protective layer he usually wore, leaving him raw and uncertain in a way that made my heart race. Dinner stretched longer than usual, Nathaniel deflecting the girls' questions about his breakup with stories about a jazz club he had discovered in Portland, a sunrise he had watched from a mountaintop in Colorado. But I could see through the performance to the man underneath, tired, adrift, looking for something he couldn't name. When he caught me watching him, our eyes would hold for a moment too long, and I would feel that familiar electricity that made me want to reach across the table and touch his hand. After the girls were in bed, we sat in the living room with glasses of wine that Evelyn had opened, talking about safe subjects, the weather, his photography work, a book I was editing about regional bird migrations. But there was a current running underneath our conversation, something urgent and unspoken that made every casual comment feel loaded with meaning. When Nathaniel mentioned feeling lost, when he talked about not knowing where he belonged, I felt him looking at me as if I might have answers to questions he wasn't brave enough to ask. Evelyn excused herself around 10, kissing my forehead with the casual affection of 15 years of marriage, telling Nathaniel that fresh towels were on the guest bed and he should make himself at home. The gesture was kind, automatic, but I saw something flicker across Nathaniel's face when she touched me, a flash of something that might have been longing or loss. When we were alone, the silence became different, heavier. I could hear the rain intensifying against the windows, could feel the weight of all the conversations we had never had pressing down on the space between us. Nathaniel sat in the armchair across from me, turning his wine glass in his hands, and I found myself studying the line of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the careful distance he maintained even when we were alone. "Do you ever think about those summers when we were kids?" he said suddenly, his voice softer than it had been all evening. "When we used to sneak out and lie on your garage roof, talking about all the places we were going to go together." I remembered those nights with startling clarity, the way the stars looked from that roof, the sound of his voice in the darkness, the promises we made about staying close no matter where life took us. We were 17 and 18 then, balanced on the edge of adulthood, believing that the intensity of our friendship would be enough to sustain us through whatever came next. We said we would never let go of each other, he continued, and there was something in his voice that made me look up from my wine. We promised that no matter what happened, no matter who we became, we would always have this connection. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to examine. I nodded, not trusting my voice, feeling the careful walls I had built around my adult life beginning to crack. Something in his expression told me he was remembering more than just those innocent summer nights. He was remembering the way we looked at each other, the way our hands would brush when we passed things between us, the charged silence that sometimes fell when we were alone. "I should probably get some sleep," he said finally, but he made no move to get up. Instead, he sat there looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, as if he was waiting for me to say something that would change the trajectory of the evening, of our lives, of everything we had been pretending not to feel for the past 20 years. When he finally stood and said goodnight, his hand touched my shoulder for just a moment, brief, almost accidental, but deliberate enough that I felt the heat of it long after he disappeared up the stairs. I sat alone in the darkened living room, listening to the sounds of him settling into the guest room, knowing that something fundamental had shifted between us, that the careful distance we had maintained was no longer sustainable. The rain continued to fall as I finally made my way upstairs, past the guest room where I could see lights still leaking from under his door, to my own bedroom where Evelyn slept peacefully, unaware that the life we had built together was balanced on the edge of a precipice I was no longer sure I wanted to step back from. The morning after Nathaniel had slipped into my bed brought a strange new awareness, as if someone had adjusted the focus on a camera that had been blurry for years. I woke to find him gone, but the memory of his warmth beside me lingered like a phantom limb. When I came downstairs, he was already in the kitchen, helping Emma find her math homework while Evelyn prepared coffee with the same efficient movements she had perfected over 15 years of mornings. "Good morning," he said, glancing up from Emma's backpack with a smile that seemed to carry the weight of our shared secret. His eyes met mine for just a moment longer than was safe, and I felt something flutter in my chest. Fear and anticipation braided together so tightly I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The days that followed were marked by shifts so subtle that anyone watching from the outside would have seen nothing unusual. Nathaniel extended his stay without fanfare, helping with small tasks around the house, joining us for meals, settling into the rhythm of our family life as if he had always been there. But for me, everything had changed. The air itself felt charged, electric with possibility and danger. I found myself watching him in ways I had never allowed myself before. The way he moved through our kitchen, opening cabinets and drawers with the familiarity of someone who belonged there. The way he listened to Claire practice violin, his head tilted in concentration, offering gentle suggestions that made her playing more confident. The way he caught my eye across the dinner table and smiled, as if we were sharing a joke that no one else could understand. These moments of connection were brief but devastating. When he passed me a dish at dinner, his fingers would brush against mine for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. When we found ourselves alone in a room, the silence would stretch between us, heavy with things we couldn't say. I began to live for these fragments of contact, these stolen seconds when the careful distance we maintained in front of others could safely collapse. My work began to suffer in ways that alarmed me. I would sit at my desk, staring at manuscripts about agricultural policies or historical preservation projects, but my mind would drift to the sound of Nathaniel's voice, the way he had said my name in the darkness, the memory of his body curved next to mine under the blanket. I missed deadlines for the first time in my career, forgot to return phone calls, found myself reading the same paragraph over and over without absorbing a single word. In desperation, I began pulling out old journals from college, from the years right after Nathaniel and I had graduated and scattered to different cities, pursuing different lives. Reading my own words from 20 years ago was like archaeology, uncovering layers of feeling I had buried so deep I had convinced myself they never existed. Entry after entry mentioned him, wondering what he was doing, missing our late-night conversations, feeling like something essential was missing from my carefully planned existence. I found photographs tucked between the pages, pictures from those last summers before everything changed. Nathaniel and me at a lake cabin, our arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning with the unconscious intimacy of people who hadn't yet learned to question what they meant to each other. Another of us lying in the grass somewhere, so close that our heads were almost touching, looking at something beyond the camera's frame with expressions of pure contentment. Looking at these images now, I could see what I had spent years refusing to acknowledge. The way we looked at each other, the way our bodies naturally gravitated toward each other, the ease and affection that went beyond ordinary friendship. How had I convinced myself that what I felt was normal, that every man experienced this kind of pull toward his closest friend, that the ache I felt when we were apart was simply nostalgia? Our conversations began to deepen in ways that felt both natural and terrifying. Late in the evenings, after Evelyn had gone to bed and the house had settled into quiet, we would sit in the living room and talk about things we had never discussed before. He told me about the restlessness that had driven him from job to job, city to city, relationship to relationship, about feeling like he was searching for something he couldn't name, some sense of home that had nothing to do with geography. "I feel like I've been pretending my whole life," he said one night, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like I've been trying to be someone I'm not, trying to want things I don't actually want. Like I'm tired of performing this version of myself that everyone expects to see." The words hit me with devastating accuracy, describing feelings I had never been able to articulate. I looked at him sitting across from me in the lamplight, his face open and vulnerable in a way that made my chest tight with longing, and I realized that he was describing exactly what I had been doing for the past 15 years. Performing the role of devoted husband, satisfied father, man who had found his place in the world and was content to stay there. What would happen, I found myself asking, if you stopped pretending? If you just allowed yourself to want what you actually want? He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I think I would have to admit that everything I've been running from, everything I've been too scared to face, has been right here all along. The silence that followed was unlike anything we had shared before. It was loaded with recognition, with the terrible relief of finally speaking truths that had been buried for too long. I could feel my heart racing, could see the way his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wine glass, and I knew that we were approaching a line that, once crossed, would change everything between us forever. For the first time in years, I felt truly awake. Not the comfortable numbness that had carried me through my adult life, but a sharp, almost painful awareness of being alive. Every nerve in my body seemed to be firing at once, every sense heightened to an almost unbearable degree. The feeling was dangerous, exhilarating, like standing on the edge of a cliff and realizing that the thing you feared most was also the thing you wanted most desperately. As I watched him across the room, saw the way the lamplight caught the line of his jaw, the way his eyes held mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe, I understood that whatever happened next, I could never go back to the sleepwalking existence I had accepted as enough. The careful architecture of my life was crumbling, and instead of terror, what I felt was an overwhelming sense of relief. It happened on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after Nathaniel had first slipped into my bed. I couldn't sleep, hadn't been able to sleep properly since that night, so I made my way downstairs to the kitchen for water, moving carefully through the darkened house. The floorboards knew all my secrets by now, every creak and protest that might wake Evelyn or the girls, and I had learned to navigate them like a ghost in my own home. When I returned, climbing the stairs with deliberate silence, I saw light spilling from beneath the guest room door. I paused in the hallway, my heart beginning to race with a mixture of anticipation and terror that had become familiar over the past weeks. Something in that thin line of light felt like an invitation, or perhaps a challenge, and before I could talk myself out of it, I found myself knocking softly on his door. "Come in," he said, his voice quiet but not surprised, as if he had been waiting for this moment as long as I had. I pushed the door open to find him sitting on the edge of the bed, still fully dressed despite the late hour. His hair was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion, and he looked up at me with an expression that was both vulnerable and determined. The small lamp cast warm shadows across the room, creating an intimate space that felt separate from the rest of the house, from the rest of our carefully constructed lives. "I couldn't sleep either," I said, though the words felt inadequate for everything that was passing between us. He nodded, understanding more than I had actually spoken, and gestured for me to sit beside him on the bed. The mattress dipped under my weight, and suddenly we were closer than we had been since that first night, close enough that I could see the slight tremor in his breathing, could smell the familiar scent of his skin. We talked for what felt like hours, our voices growing quieter as the conversation grew more intimate. He told me about dreams he had been having, dreams where we were different people living different lives, dreams where the choices we had made didn't matter and we could simply be ourselves without apology or explanation. He spoke about feeling like a stranger in his own life, about relationships that had felt like performances, about the growing certainty that he had been running from something that might actually be worth running toward. "I've never been able to name it," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "This thing I feel when I'm with you. This sense that everything else in my life is just marking time until I can be in the same room as you again." The words hung in the air between us, raw and honest in a way that made my chest tight with emotion. I could feel the careful barriers I had built around my heart beginning to crumble, could feel 20 years of buried feelings rising to the surface with a force that terrified me. "I know," I said, The admission feeling like jumping off a cliff. I feel it too. I always have. He turned to look at me then, really look at me, and I saw my own fear and longing reflected in his eyes. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out, his fingers barely brushing against the back of my hand where it rested on the bedspread. The touch was so light it might have been imagined, but it sent electricity shooting through my entire body, making me understand that every casual contact we had shared over the years had been building toward this moment. I didn't move away, couldn't move away. Instead, I found myself turning my hand over, palm up, allowing his fingers to trace the lines there with a gentleness that made my breath catch. We sat like that for what felt like an eternity, connected by that small point of contact, both of us afraid to breathe too deeply or move too suddenly, as if the moment might shatter if we acknowledged it too directly. Then Nathaniel leaned toward me, the movement so gradual it seemed to take forever, and I felt my own body responding, drawn by a gravity I had spent my adult life resisting. When our lips finally met, the kiss was tentative, trembling, as if we were both testing the limits of what we could bear. It lasted only seconds, but in those seconds, everything I thought I knew about myself was rewritten. The terror was immediate and overwhelming. I pulled back, my face burning with shame and guilt, but also with a relief so sharp and profound it nearly brought me to tears. Every nerve in my body was alive, every sense heightened to an almost unbearable degree, and I realized with devastating clarity that this was what I had been waiting for my entire life. Not just the physical contact, but the recognition, the acknowledgement of something I had buried so deep I had convinced myself it didn't exist. I should go, I whispered, but I made no move to stand. Instead, I sat there looking at him, memorizing the way the lamplight caught his features, the way his eyes held mine with an intensity that made it hard to think about anything else. "Should you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Or should you stay and figure out what this means?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications that extended far beyond this room, this moment, this single night. I thought about Evelyn sleeping down the hall, about Emma and Claire in their beds, about the life I had built on a foundation of assumptions I was no longer sure I believed. I thought about the man sitting beside me, about the 20 years we had spent dancing around this truth, about the possibility that it might not be too late to choose authenticity over safety. "I don't know what it means," I said finally, the honesty feeling both liberating and terrifying. "But I know I can't pretend anymore that it doesn't exist." He reached for my hand again, this time without hesitation, and I let him take it, let him hold it between both of his, as if it were something precious and fragile. In that touch, I felt the weight of everything we had never said to each other, everything we had been too afraid to acknowledge, everything that had been hidden beneath the surface of our friendship for longer than I cared to admit. For the first time in my adult life, I allowed myself to imagine what it might feel like to stop running from who I really was. The days after the kiss passed in a haze of careful avoidance and stolen glances. I moved through the routines of my life like an actor who had forgotten his lines, fumbling through conversations with Evelyn, responding late to the girls' questions, spending longer than necessary at the office because I was afraid of what my face might reveal when I walked through the front door. But Evelyn had always been more observant than I gave her credit for. 15 years of marriage had taught her to read the subtle shifts in my mood, the way I held my shoulders when I was worried, the particular quality of silence that meant I was wrestling with something I couldn't share. She began watching me with the careful attention of someone who suspects that important information is being withheld, and I found myself avoiding her eyes at dinner, deflecting her gentle inquiries about my work, my health, my thoughts. Nathaniel, meanwhile, moved through our house with a new kind of awareness, as if the kiss had awakened something in him as well. Our interactions were charged with electricity that we both tried to disguise, hands that lingered when passing dishes, conversations that carried double meanings, moments of eye contact that lasted just long enough to remind us both of what had passed between us in the guest room. He helped with household tasks, played with the children, maintained easy conversation with Evelyn, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, The way his eyes would find mine across the room and hold them with an intensity that made my breath catch. The breaking point came on a Friday evening in November. The girls were upstairs doing homework, and Nathaniel had excused himself to take a phone call about a photography job in Seattle. I was loading the dishwasher with mechanical precision when I felt Evelyn's presence behind me, solid and patient in a way that made my hands still on the plates. "Julian," she said quietly, and something in her tone made me turn around. She was standing by the kitchen table, her arms crossed, wearing the expression I had learned to recognize over the years as her way of preparing for difficult conversations. "We need to talk." I dried my hands on the dish towel, buying time I didn't really have, and joined her at the table where we had shared thousands of meals, made countless decisions about our life together, discussed everything from household budgets to the girls' school projects. The familiar space suddenly felt charged with danger, as if sitting down might trigger an explosion I wasn't prepared for. "You've been different these past few weeks," she continued, her voice steady but not unkind. "Distant, distracted, like you're somewhere else even when you're sitting right next to me." I opened my mouth to offer the kind of reassurance I had perfected over the years. Work stress, seasonal tiredness, nothing worth worrying about, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself looking at this woman who had shared my life for so long, who had given me children and stability and the kind of comfortable partnership that most people spent their lives searching for, and I realized that I couldn't lie to her anymore. "It's not work," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's not anything I can explain easily." She nodded, as if she had been expecting this admission, and I saw something flicker across her face that might have been relief or resignation or the particular sadness that comes with having your suspicions confirmed. "Try," she said simply. The words came slowly, painfully, like extracting splinters from an old wound. I told her about feeling like a stranger in my own life, about going through the motions of happiness without experiencing the substance of it, about the growing certainty that I had been living according to a script written by someone else. I talked about the silence I had carried for so long, the weight of pretending to be content with choices that had never felt entirely my own. "And Nathaniel," she said when I paused, not a question but a statement that hung in the air between us like smoke. The sound of his name spoken by her, in this context, with this weight of understanding behind it, made my chest tighten with guilt and fear and something that might have been relief. I nodded, unable to trust my voice, and watched her face carefully for signs of anger or betrayal or the kind of devastation that would make this conversation unbearable. Instead, she was eerily calm, her eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed less about surprise than about the confirmation of something she had sensed but hoped wasn't true. "He's not just a friend to you," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to gather at the corners of her eyes. "No," I said, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. "He's not just a friend. He never has been." The silence that followed was unlike any we had shared in 15 years of marriage. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of the girls' voices upstairs, the settling of the house around us as it adjusted to the weight of this new truth. Evelyn sat across from me, her hands folded on the table, and I could see her processing the implications of what I had just told her, calculating the damage to the life we had built together. "Do you love him?" she asked finally, and the question was so direct, so stripped of artifice, that I felt my last defenses crumble. "Yes," I said, the word feeling both like a confession and a release. "I love him. I think I always have." She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, they were filled with a pain that I knew I had caused, that I would carry with me regardless of what happened next. But there was also something else there, a kind of weary acceptance, as if she had been waiting for this conversation longer than either of us had realized. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked, and I heard in her voice the understanding that this was not a problem that could be solved with therapy or time or good intentions. This was a fundamental truth about who I was, about what I needed, about the kind of life I wanted to live. "I don't know," I said, and it was the most honest thing I had said in years. "I don't know what any of this means, or where it goes, or how to even begin to figure it out." I just know that I can't keep pretending anymore. Upstairs, I could hear the faint sound of Nathaniel's voice on his phone call, probably discussing travel arrangements and payment schedules, unaware that the foundation of our careful arrangement was shifting beneath us. In a few hours, the girls would need help with their bedtime routines, would expect their normal Friday night of movies and popcorn, would want the security of parents who had their lives figured out. But sitting at that kitchen table, looking at Evelyn's tear-stained face and feeling the weight of 2 decades of unspoken truth finally settling between us, I understood that whatever came next, there could be no going back to the comfortable numbness I had mistaken for contentment. The choice was no longer between safety and risk, but between authenticity and suffocation, between the life I had built and the person I had always been afraid to become. I didn't sleep that night. After our conversation at the kitchen table, after Evelyn had quietly excused herself and disappeared upstairs, I sat alone in the darkened living room watching shadows move across the walls, listening to the house settle around me like a living thing adjusting to new weight. Somewhere after midnight, I heard Nathaniel's footsteps in the hallway, heard him pause outside the living room doorway, but neither of us spoke. The silence carried its own conversation, questions and answers that didn't need words, an understanding that everything was about to change. Around 3 in the morning, I climbed the stairs to our bedroom. Evelyn was awake, lying on her side facing away from me, her breathing too careful to be natural. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the life we had built together, the matching nightstands, the framed wedding photo on her dresser, the small accumulation of shared years that had felt so permanent just hours before. I removed my wedding ring in the darkness, the band sliding off my finger with surprising ease after 15 years of constant wear. The metal felt cold and foreign in my palm, like an artifact from someone else's life. I placed it on my nightstand next to hers, the soft click as it touched the wood seeming louder than it should have been in the quiet room. I packed a single suitcase, moving through the closet and dresser drawers like a ghost collecting pieces of myself. A few changes of clothes, the leather journal I had kept sporadically over the years, a photograph of Emma and Claire from last summer's vacation. Everything else, the accumulated possessions of a lifetime, the books and furniture and small domestic treasures, belonged to the man I had been pretending to be, not to whoever I was about to become. Morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. I carried my suitcase downstairs as the first light began to filter through the kitchen windows, setting it by the front door like a quiet declaration. In the kitchen, Evelyn was already moving through the familiar rhythm of preparing breakfast, but everything about her movements seemed different, more deliberate, more careful, as if she were performing these domestic rituals for the last time. She didn't look at me when I entered the room, but I saw her eyes flick toward the counter where my wedding ring sat next to hers, 2 small circles of gold that had once symbolized promises we both believed we could keep. The sight of them lying there, no longer connected to living hands, felt like looking at relics from an archaeological dig, evidence of lives that had once existed but were no longer accessible. The girls came downstairs as they always did, Emma rushing to find her backpack, Claire moving slowly through her morning routine, both of them oblivious to the seismic shift that had occurred overnight. I hugged them longer than usual, breathing in the smell of their hair, memorizing the weight of their small bodies against mine. They would understand eventually, when they were older, when life had taught them that sometimes love requires impossible choices. For now, they simply accepted my longer embraces as one of the inexplicable behaviors of adults. Nathaniel appeared in the kitchen doorway as I was pouring coffee, his eyes immediately finding mine across the room. He looked as if he hadn't slept either, his hair disheveled, his clothes wrinkled from a night spent wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. But when he saw the suitcase by the door, when he understood what I had chosen in the dark hours of the morning, something in his expression shifted from uncertainty to quiet recognition. We didn't speak of logistics or future plans. Those conversations would come later, in hotel rooms and borrowed apartments, in the long months of learning how to build a life that wasn't constructed around the expectations of others. Instead, We moved through the morning like two people who had finally found their rhythm after years of dancing out of step. When it was time to leave, I found myself standing on the front porch with Nathaniel beside me, looking back at the house that had contained my life for so many years. Evelyn appeared in the kitchen window, her silhouette framed by the morning light, and for a moment our eyes met through the glass. She raised her hand slightly, not quite a wave, not quite a blessing, but an acknowledgement that something had ended and something else was beginning. Nathaniel's car waited in the driveway, loaded with his few possessions, and now mine as well. He turned to me before opening the driver's door, his eyes searching my face for signs of doubt or regret. Instead, he reached for my hand, holding it briefly between both of his, and in that simple touch I felt the weight of 20 years of silence finally lifting. "Are you ready?" he asked, and I understood that he wasn't asking about the car ride or the immediate logistics of leaving. He was asking if I was ready to stop running from who I had always been, if I was ready to choose truth over safety, if I was ready to discover what my life might look like when it was actually mine. "I'm ready," I said, and meant it. As we drove away, I watched the house grow smaller in the side mirror until it disappeared entirely behind a stand of trees. The rain that had been falling for days had finally stopped, and the sky was beginning to clear, revealing patches of blue that seemed impossibly bright after so much gray. I felt something in my chest that I hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness, exactly, but something quieter and more sustainable. Relief, perhaps. The sense of finally being able to breathe. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with questions we didn't yet know how to answer. But for the first time in my adult life, I was moving towards something instead of away from it, choosing authenticity over performance, choosing the terrifying freedom of being exactly who I was meant to be. The revolution was quiet, almost anticlimactic, but no less complete for its subtlety. A life had been altered, a truth had finally been acknowledged, and whatever came next would be built on the foundation of that acknowledgement. In the passenger seat beside me, Nathaniel drove with the careful attention of someone carrying precious cargo, and I understood that what we were carrying was not just ourselves, but the possibility of a future we had never dared to imagine. The exhale I released as we reached the highway felt like the first real breath I had taken in decades.